I know you're all familiar with the phrase, so-and-so needs no introduction, and you could say that about Tommy, but I need an introduction because you don't know who the hell I am. I'm an academic, and I know when you say that, you get a bit nervous, right? And you hear my accent and you figure I'm a Yank, so that's 2 strikes against me. So I got a lot of catching up here. But I'm also an activist, and I've actually been an activist for quite some time. In fact, I was touching base with Brian here and saying our paths first crossed 20 years ago. In this city, actually, we were a part of a delegation that went up to Belfast. It was mostly Dubs and token Yank. We went up to visit and stayed with different, we visited different community groups and political campaigning groups and Sinn Féin. That was 20 years ago, which was 1991, which was also an anniversary year, of course. That marked the 10th anniversary of the hunger strikes. And for me, that was sort of where I came in. That's when I really got involved in things, both over here and back in the States, back and forth. So in that time, I've attended lots of commemorations, lots of talks like this, and these are important. But more often than not, and this is me, I'm an outsider. I see things a little bit differently. I learned that no matter how much Guinness I drink, I'm not Irish. I've lived here 10 years, but that's still, you know, I'm the Yank. So I look at things a little bit differently. I didn't experience things firsthand. I was only 10 years old when the hunger strikes were on, and I was back in the States, and my family weren't particularly political. So I came by this a bit later. But I came at this as an activist. And what I noticed at a lot of these talks or commemorations, at least in my humble opinion, was they were a bit incomplete. And they didn't tell, or they told or acknowledged only part of the story. And I'd argue that what's usually missing, in fact, is one of the most important parts of the story. This is particularly the case if I'm addressing a group of self-proclaimed political activists. Because to borrow a phrase from Mother Jones, we pray for the dead, but we fight like hell for the living. We're moving forward, but we're always thinking that way. We draw inspiration from the past, but we're always looking forward. So I understand why there's a strong focus on what happened in the jails, both in the blanket protest and the hunger strikes. But I'm going to be sort of, I'm invited to a Remember the Hunger Strikers talk, and I'm not going to talk about the hunger strikers. I'm going to talk about what happened outside, because that's more interesting to me, because there was a document that People's Democracy put out, and this was August 1981, and they said that perhaps the biggest and broadest solidarity movement since Vietnam grew up around the hunger strike campaign. That's fascinating to me. Years later, a colleague and friend of mine, Kevin Bean, whose book on Sinn Féin you should read, he remarked that that struggle, that marked the last great wave of activism and mobilization within the nationalist population. That was 30 years ago, and that was the last great wave of activism and mobilization. So the activist in me says, it screams, this is where you should be looking. This is where you might learn some lessons. Not simply lessons that apply to those who were involved in the struggle and drawing attention to what's happening in McGabry. I mean, it's not just about prison issues. It's about any sort of social change, radical political and social change. There's lots of lessons to be learned. It's all about building movements, you know, from the bottom up, and that's what happened. And in a way, it sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but you know, it's 30 years on, and someone should have wrote my book long before I did. So I'm not going to say too much of the detail in terms of the history of the anti-criminalization campaign, because that's a lecture, and that's not what you're here for. But I want to raise a few points to consider, things to remember, things to maybe ask yourself. These are points that are both specific to that campaign, but also can be generalized, again, to almost any campaign for radical political and social change, which I think we're all about. And if I've done my job right, I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers, because, you know, I'm not here to tell you what to think, I just want you to think. One of the things I'll begin with is a quote from, this is something that Jim Gibney wrote, and he said that the story of the Republican struggle's revival started in September 1976 when Kieran Nugent, the first blanket man, refused to wear a prison uniform. Most people wouldn't disagree with that. But I kind of raise my hand and say, well, wait a second, the Relatives Action Committee, that's an important event, and I don't take away from the courage of Kieran Nugent. The Relatives Action Committees were formed in Easter 1976. Throughout the spring and summer of that year, Lily Fitzsimmons, a prominent activist in the campaign, said there were daily pickets, leafleting. As early as February 1976, People's Democracy were trying to engage in a joint campaign, or approach Sinn Féin for a joint campaign on the issue. They had started a petition on this issue. So there was activity. A movement is like a tree in a lot of ways. It has roots, deep roots, that you don't always see, but they're there, and they're very important. And that's something you should always remember. There's the things that you can see, the big events that usually get in the history books, but you really have to dig, because things, there's more to that you should look at. And one of the things I also wanted to point out in terms of that, when we talk to the Relatives Action Committees, it's often sort of pointed out that a lot of them were the wives and the mothers and the sisters of prisoners, and that's kind of just left at that. They weren't just the wives and mothers and sisters of prisoners, they were activists in their own right. They were seasoned activists. Some of them were more politically sophisticated than the men inside at the time, who were very young and politically naive, but were fighting a brave fight in the prisons. But some of these people had long histories, as some were ex-prisoners themselves. Some came from prominent Republican families who, grew up with this and had an understanding of prison struggle. Some were active in the civil rights movement. Some were active in the anti-internment movement. Some were community activists, longtime community activists. For example, you always, the image of Mary Nellis, I live in Derry, and that's one of the first blanket protests by those outside the prison. She and two other women stood outside St. Eugene's Cathedral in blankets. And that's very dramatic, and people point to that. But, a couple weeks before, Mary Nellis organized a conference in Cregan, which had over 100 people at it. People don't really think of that, but there's the dramatic side of things, but there's also the hard, sort of not very glamorous work of building a movement, and it's banging your head against the wall. I mean, that's what's been said in the past, 76, 77, 78, it wasn't thousands of people out on the street, but this was all the necessary sort of stuff that had to go on. That's kind of what I try and tease out in my book. And when I say this, I'm not trying to hawk a book here, although I kind of am, but I think this is important stuff to know, that movements don't just appear overnight. And they also, the people who are involved in these movements, they don't come out of nowhere. Also, some of the political activists, they had a long history in jail struggles, in political struggles, some which predate, the civil rights movement. So I think that's something you always have to remind yourself. So it underscores a need for experienced activists, even in times of, when the struggle takes a downturn. When it goes up, you need people who are experienced and know what they're doing. Because these are skills, and they don't come easily. Another sort of thing to think about that comes out of this movement is working with other groups, and that's very relevant today. Because republicanism is so fractured, and there's lots of different groups. It's probably more complicated now because you have prisoners representing, a number of different groups. Then it was just, prisoners from two separate groups, but you also had a number of different groups on the political side of things. Getting to that point where there was some sort of anti-imperialist unity was a very difficult process. There was a lot of steps forward, step back. There was a lot of actual resistance from the Republican movement at the time to get to that stage. Again, these things, it's part of the hard, sort of not so glamorous part of building a movement. And it can't be glossed over because you have to learn from that. And one of the things, and I don't have the answers for this, after the hunger, there was an uneasy sort of unity up until when the hunger strike ended. It's amazing how quickly that fell apart, partly because some of the groups fell apart. but there was an expressed desire, not simply by people in smaller groups, but even by prisoners inside the prisons. I've seen the motions put forward at the Ardèche in 1981. Prisoners wanting some sort of broad anti-imperialist movement. I don't know if those motions were adopted or not, but it didn't happen. Again, looking at trying to figure out how groups work together is something that we're still struggling with, but it's worth looking at back then. Elections. Everyone looks back at that time and says this is, well, not everyone, but oftentimes it's pointed out that this is when Sinn Féin entered the political process. That's actually not really true. Provisional Sinn Féin contested elections in the 70s down south. They just didn't contest elections up north. But issues like abstentionism, of course, were a big issue in the campaign. But also another issue was democracy. Who determines what candidates put forward? I've come across letters that were sent to the National H Block Committee from local committees saying, we were never consulted about putting so-and-so up in our area. We would have told you that they wouldn't have had a chance. And I know that today, people, especially down south, have had issues with a party imposing candidates. It causes resentment but actually, one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of elections, or one of the things that is interesting to think about, again, I don't have the answers, is what effect does electoral politics have on popular movements? Now, back home, I've heard friends say that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of all social movements. In the course of my research, I came across a quote from Mitchell McLaughlin saying that this was in '89, saying that we're less of a movement of the streets. Now people are saying, well, what do we have councillors for? I mean, is electoral politics depoliticizing? Again, questions keep raising. Violence, issues of violence. In a strange way, state violence actually helped this campaign grow. At least what was happening inside the interrogation centers. It was that outrage which a lot of the anti-criminalization activists, particularly in the Relatives Action Committee, they were able to link those issues, and that helped the campaign tremendously. At the same time, state violence on the outside had a detrimental effect. Also, Republican violence on some levels had a detrimental effect on building something broader. Again, I'm not saying this as saying everyone should be pacifist. I'm saying you just have to think about these issues. How do you reach out to people who oppose political violence? And then sort of issues of long-term impact. I came across a thesis written by Dara O'Hagan, who was a former MLA. She's from up north. Some of you may know who she is. She wrote about the Catholic Church and republicanism. And one of the things she was saying was about, one of the lines was about the impact the hunger strikes had down south. I mean, there's no denying that the hunger strikes and the campaign in support of the hunger strikers and the prisoners had tremendous impact on the north. But she says the Republican orthodoxy that the hunger strikes have had any long-term effects in the south is highly dubious. It changed Republican policy towards the Irish Republic. That is something quite different. The hunger strikes, in fact, pointed out the limitations of pure Republican politics here. And the reason I bring this up is not because there were people who were inspired, people who lived down here and became lifelong activists. But, you know, the next general election down south after the hunger strikes, Sinn Féin and the IRSP, who also contested the elections, they bombed. And it took a long time for them to build some sort of base. And even now, is it an anti-Fianna Fáil vote or is it a pro-Sinn Féin vote? The point I'm getting at is for there to be an appeal for Republican politics outside of the North, I think there needs to be, and this is something I think Éirígí talks about too, is not just the national question, but the social question. The need to develop a radical, sort of new vision of republicanism that speaks to people down here who never go up north and have no need to go up north. And I'll just throw these things at you and haven't talked a lot about the actual history, and if you want to ask questions about that, we can do that later. But I thought probably this is the best thing for me, I thought, to do, and I think it's particularly relevant because we are talking in previous discussions about learning lessons from the past, the need to build up movements, and I think we need to be reminded that it's not easy, but there are lessons there. And while I understand, again, why we focus on the prison protests, we're missing out on things if we don't look at what happened outside and how that was built. And I know that doesn't top his talk, but I hope that just gives you some food for thought, and that you explore what happened outside. And I think there's, again, real lessons there for all of us. Thank you.